Welcome everyone to our Tech in 20 series. Today we're going to talk about 802.1x wireless and security and information about how we currently use wireless, how we probably should use wireless, and today we have Paul Levesque going to help us understand that. As always, we have live polls that you can answer either via text messaging at 22333 using the keywords at the bottom of the poll, or go online to any browser at pollev.com/tech20. And so we look forward to getting some feedback from you, and if you have questions, you can either put them in the chat at WebEx or wait for the operator at the end and we'll take care of those. So without any further ado, we'll turn this over to Paul.
Thank you, Clayton. So we're going to be talking a little bit more about 802.1x and 802.1x wireless this evening. So first thing, the poll that you see here on the front screen, have you ever poached a wireless network? I suspected with this crowd the number would be a whole lot higher than that, but I guess that's pretty accurate. What we mean by license there is that you've never actually done that, and you've probably only utilized what's required of you. Given this crowd, I suspect that we've all stayed in hotels or other locations where we've actually poached some wireless networking to get access to what we need to have done. But let's go into the details a little bit more about what 802.1x wireless is and give you a little bit more information about what it's used for and other things that are out there as well. So first of all, let's talk about what 802.1x is not. Well, it's not a protocol. It's basically a framework for a port-based access control method. What happens over 802.1x wireless and wired is that you're allowed to pass different kinds of traffic. How that information traverses from one device to the other involves something called EAP, or Extensible Authentication Protocol. That's more the authentication method that's going to be used by 802.1x. So, for example, you've probably played around with your desktop before and connected up to a wireless, either your home PC or your work PC, and you kind of looked at it and you went into something called the Wireless Zero Config client. And you've probably gone in there and you've selected something and configured it. But what you're doing is you're enabling EAP and you're enabling 802.1x to allow you to do some wireless connectivity. So in my words, remote access sort of transcends every customer vertical that we sell to and that we support. But quite honestly, it also transcends our everyday lives. We do it all the time, right? We see ourselves there. So thinking about 802.1x, we're going to learn about a few quick terms. Think of it this way. There are three different types of devices in an 802.1x wireless environment. The first is something called a supplicant, and basically a supplicant is a device that requires authentication to the network. So if we're going to take that into a term, we're going to think of the supplicant as being your 802.1x client running on your PC, or the PC itself, or perhaps a VPN client that's running on your PC. That would be a supplicant, so something that's used to communicate between your device and, in this case, the authenticator, which is the device which acts as a relay agent between the supplicant and the authentication server. So think of the authenticator like an access point, a wireless access point. We probably all have one of those in our home somewhere. But you can have a wireless access point, or even a VPN server would be considered a good authenticator. Now, again, that communicates with an authentication server. So an authentication server, the third type, is the device that authenticates the supplicant. So when the supplicant presents themselves to the authenticator passes that traffic through to the authentication server. And again, that server typically uses either an internal database to the device or an external database of authorized users, so a centralized location of where all of the user information or user credentials are stored. And it's typically going to be a Radius server. So in this case, think of Radius, and Radius is an acronym for what this is, Remote Authentication Dial-In User Service. Kind of a neat little acronym, and that's why it's always capitalized when you see it in a wireless environment. So again, Radius is a client-server protocol. It contains software that enables remote access servers to communicate with a centralized server to authenticate the dial-in users and authorize their access to the requested systems or service. So literally, it's basically saying, I have a central repository of all of my credentials. Radius is the central point that allows all of that information to be contacted. So in other words, it's also, in this case, the authentication server can also be an authenticator because it actually may or may not contain the actual credentials used to authenticate that user. So again, Radius is really just, a way of, protocol and software that enables things to happen. Now, when you're talking about Radius, you're talking about something called AAA or a AAA server, which means it can handle three very unique things. One is authentication. So I either authenticate a device, I authenticate a user, I authenticate a certificate or a credential of some sort. And the second thing it does is authorization. So not only does it authenticate a credential, but it has the ability to say, well, you're authorized for certain things, like maybe you're accessing a specific network, or maybe you're not connecting to a particular network, but you're being given a very specific set of throttling so that I can say, well, you only have so much bandwidth available to you. So again, authorization codes are very much like that. And the third piece that can be considered part of AAA or a Radius server is accounting. So accounting is the third piece that says, well, I need to be able to track that. I need to be able to find out where you came from, what you used for a credential, what I gave you for access points, what I gave you for access information, so that, again, that can be applied centrally across all the different networks. So VLANing, for example, comes in the authorization place. Well, if that VLAN has a certain access to whatever network things you need to have, well, if there's ever a breach there, you go back to the accounting phase to decide how that information is going to be applied. There's also a concept of something called NAC, or Network Access Control, which is essentially creating sort of a way of implementing those three AAA pieces, authentication, authorization, and accounting, all as part of an overall architecture. So we're going to talk a little bit more about what that is and how that works in the next slide here, but I'm going to give you a little bit more detail. So again, we get into the what does it look like phase for 802.1x wireless. Now, this can be a little busy, and there's a whole bunch of information there, and I told you about EAPs and all kinds of things, and what you're seeing here is basically just how it starts, the initiation process. Well, the supplicant does an EAP overland start request to the authenticator. The authenticator says, well, tell me what kind of EAP type you want to use and who are you? Well, that gets into the authentication phase. I'm now going to give you a response. My name is Alice. Well, I'm going to take that response and pass it off to a Radius server. That Radius access request is going to say, well, here's Alice. What do we want to do? And they say, oh, are you using PEEP? The answer is yes, I'm using PEEP. Okay, well then what is your credential information? That's the authentication process going through that. So PEEP and LEAP and TTLS and all these other wonderful protocols were developed by different types of vendors that are out there. Cisco has created some, Microsoft has created some. There are some that only support certain kinds of authentication. There are a bunch of standards out there with regards to how that communication happens. Typically in an environment of, a Microsoft Active Directory kind of structure, it's going to be using PEEP, and you're going to be using your Microsoft domain credentials, so your username and password that you have for a domain. So again, that's a way of authenticating you through the authentication server to your Active Directory domain. And now I'm going to do something called authorization. Well, once I've successfully authenticated your credential, I'm going to do an accept, and I'm going to send you back a success message, and I'm going to say, well, you're assigned VLAN 10, and you have an ACL or access control list of X. And I'm going to send that information back down to the authenticator so that that authenticator can apply that particular VLANing or that particular access control list or that particular threshold of throttling techniques that are being done, or what you have access to and what you don't have access to. So that's the authorization phase. And then the accounting as well. Obviously, that's typically saying, start accounting. I want to know what you're doing, how long you're staying on. Things like that begin to go into that process. So from a really, kind of deep diagram level, this is what 802.1x's wireless is doing behind the scenes in a typical, corporate environment. Really interesting quote over here on the far left by John Chambers, the CEO at Cisco Systems, is, he has said this many times, NAC is by far the most needed remote access customer solution on the market, but it is by far the least deployed. And typically why that becomes an issue is because, well, most of these EAP types and this concept of network access control requires you to have like systems, which basically means, well, Cisco implemented theirs in a very particular fashion and their network access control is handled that way. And typically the only way to get that sort of ubiquitous control over all of your network access devices is that they all need to be running Cisco system devices, or Juniper, or any of those other vendors. And there are very few networks out there that are currently heterogeneous like that and have only one kind of hardware. So again, that becomes an issue. And unfortunately, 10 years ago, there were probably 500, 600 vendors that were all pushing this idea of NAC. But once they found out that people were still siloed with regards to how they're going to allow it to happen, so there are different NAC things out there. Cisco has one, Juniper has a different one. They share some attributes, and through software, those attributes allow some of the things to happen, but not all the things to happen. So some of the specialized functionalities are relegated only to working with Cisco boxes or wireless access points that were developed by Belkin or whoever else is out there. So again, that became a big issue, and it's by far made the reason why it's the least deployed solution on the market today. So 802.1x wireless, I guess probably the best way to describe it is, well, surprise, you do some form of 802.1x wireless every single day of your life if you've established a home network and you're using WEP or WPA or something called a PSK or pre-shared keys. Basically what you're doing is you're setting up some kind of 802.1x wireless between your home device and your home wireless access point. So rather than saying I'm identifying myself to that device, I'm identifying my device to that particular wireless router. I'm saying to the wireless router, I have the pre-shared key that I'm supposed to have to connect to you successfully and allow you to do that. That's providing for a little bit better security than what I had been doing the first 5 years I moved into my home. My next door neighbor, I never paid for internet access in my home. The first 5 years I lived here, I actually would use my next door neighbor's wireless access point. As long as you didn't do anything malicious, it wasn't such a bad thing. But because he had no security applied on his access point, I jumped on there and got a connection and got an IP, and I got through to the internet and was able to utilize that. And quite honestly, I think a lot of people do that, especially when they travel and go out of the office. So again, that's a little bit about what home networking and security is involved in home networking. And now you get into the office side, which is how to identify myself. So rather than just saying the device has the ability to connect from my device to my network, I now introduce something called PEEP or TTLS or other thing, introduces a user authentication as part of that process. So rather than just saying, okay, I negotiate with the access point and my device is good, it now says, well, who are you? And I want to be able to use that credential to authenticate it to an Active Directory source, as you can see on the right-hand side, with regards to saying, well, are you part of an Active Directory? Yes, you are. Your domain credentials are good. And, oh, by the way, here's an access control list that I can give through to that wireless access point, and it can apply those ACLs and everything else that needs to protect that by assigning you to a particular VLAN or otherwise, or even going as far as to display those great little messages we get when we log on to our corporate networks lately. Those are always really exciting, and those actually come through those access points. All that information is there, and it's prompted usually by group or other things. So again, that's part of what you're looking at with regards to wireless networking, how the wireless networking is established, and the differences between home and an office. So if you're a member of the CA Security Business Unit, you need to know the importance of something called RAM, or Remote Access Management. We're all very, very familiar with typically something called Web Access Management, if you understand what those products are. But when we talk about Remote Access Management, it's something to really talk about customers with regards to security. Because again, the big picture here is what changes when we introduce something called Bring Your Own Device. Well, in the situation of when I say, well, bring your own device is a great discussion point with customers right now. Do you have a strategy for it? How are you dealing with it? What are you doing with it? Quite honestly, the last couple of years at RSA, the RSA conference, everyone talks about this BYOD problem and how do we solve it. And, of course, hardware guys say, secure the device. Software guys say secure the data. Network guys say secure the network. And legal guys say none of you have an answer, and oh, by the way, most other people don't have an answer either. So quite honestly, again, this changes the paradigm, right, is I want you to be able to grant access to the network with a device that I've never seen before. So what do I do with that? How do I handle that? Because, again, you don't have that pre-shared key to authenticate the device to your wireless network. So you need to use a domain credential, and you need to put that stuff into play to get that stuff to work. So what else do we need to know about the device? Is it jailbroken, for example? Is that something to think about? Is that something to take into consideration in the solution? So again, those are the kinds of things we need to know not only about the network, but also about the device too. So the poll here, which is kind of interesting, says, using the premise of AAA, which what we learned about AAA was authentication, authorization, and accounting, what CA security product could also be considered a AAA server? Well, it's very interesting.
Paul, it's interesting. I thought that everybody was just guessing when there was just one answer in each one of the things. It was like, okay, we'll just guess.
Yeah, somebody's just going to guess at every one of them. That way they can't get it wrong, right? But quite honestly, when you think about it, what product that is out there currently that CA security product line has, it has, well, authorization, authentication, and accounting. And quite honestly, the best fit for that would be SiteMinder. SiteMinder, in fact, handles what we call web access management and does a very good job of that and has the ability to do all of those three things built into its solution. So while Advanced Auth and AuthMinder, which some folks chose here, allows you to say, well, you can have access by authenticating you, it doesn't carry any authorization pieces. It doesn't say, well, I can't apply with those two solutions that you only have access to these network resources. So again, that's an issue there. CloudMinder does have some of that, or excuse me, ControlMinder does have some of that stuff, but it doesn't necessarily have the full-blown accounting phase. It does have sort of logging, but not necessarily accounting in that particular space. So again, the best answer for this particular poll would be specifically the SiteMinder solution, which is the best fit. So to kind of wrap up our discussion for, well, what does this mean for you? Here's a couple of things to think about. 802.1x is used by us all every single day, all the time. Everyone is always using this stuff. You're using it at home. Your kids are using it. You probably do know, but you didn't know until now. Bring your own device changes the model for AAA because, again, now not only do I authenticate the device, but I also need to take into effect the fact that the device may be at risk and that it's bringing additional risk onto my network because I don't know what it is and I don't know what it's carrying, and I can't guarantee that there's software on it that's going to handle those kind of things. NAC, by far, obviously, it's the most needed. I hear that from a lot of customers when I have discussions with them about what they're doing in their wireless networking environments. It's something that everybody says I have to get. Campuses for universities and other things need to have that kind of security across all the different places. They can say, well, just to give you an example, like a university would say a student can have access to only this side of things via this VLAN and only this much bandwidth when they're in a public place. But when they're in a classroom, I'm going to give them a different set of access control lists. So they know it's needed, but again, they also know that they don't have all the same and like equipment and hardware across all of their networks to be able to deploy that. So it's by far something that they're moving towards, but it's just not there yet. Always be on the alert for new opportunities and new discussion points. Again, an additional question to think about here too, how can we improve wireless security? Where do we think we're going with this? Quite honestly, AAA has been around, believe it or not, since the early 80s. The concept of a radius server, I worked for a company called Funk Software that was the first company to create a radius server, and I used to laugh about it. The product was called Steel Belted Radius, which kind of everybody thought was an interesting tag name. But it was developed by a person who worked at MIT, and I worked for that company for a short amount of time. And quite honestly, they had a radius solution in place that carriers were using back in the late 70s and early 80s. So those solutions have been there forever. Well, what's next? How do you improve that more? How do we get that ubiquitous NAC kind of experience across all the different networks that are out there? So that's it for the presentation part, and I think now we can kind of go into some of the questions that we see here. Does the wireless is wireless performance correlated to what type of security? I would say...
Hang on just a second, Paul.
Sure.
Paul, hang on just a second. Tiffany, can you check and see if there's any questions on the line, please?
At this time, I'm showing no questions on the phone lines.
Okay, go ahead, Paul, and if there's any questions, use *1 to ask any questions, okay?
Okay, so the wireless performance to type of security, I would say no. Again, because I really think that these kinds of things, different types of authentications typically aren't going to be a problem to these different environments. Protocols are usually set up fairly quickly. I would say that 802.1x is limited specifically by the different types that you use. So there's 802.11a and G and B and all of those different things. And basically what they are is bandwidth and bandwidth capabilities and availabilities. So quite honestly, that's really what all of this stuff is all about. The authentication credential really is a very small transitional packet. So I would say as far as, is security going to cause a problem? Absolutely not. And that's typically why folks are definitely looking at security as being part of that solution. I think there's a lot of good information here. You're welcome if there's, other questions. Anyone have any other questions?
We do have one question from the phone line, from the line of Nad Samarvision.
Sounds like Nat.
Hey, Paul. Nat here. Good presentation. So, question about how enterprises can reuse infrastructure that they already set up, not for wireless security, but for general network access security. Are they looking to redeploy the same infrastructure for wireless as well? Would that work? For instance, using the same Radius servers and other authorization schemes that they have deployed. Would those work for wireless access as well?
They do. And interestingly enough, Radius is sort of a remote access kind of, like I said earlier, it's more of an authentication device. If you send the traffic to it and it supports that particular standard of Radius, it can then talk to wherever the authentication credentials need to go. And I've seen people use Radius servers or repurpose Radius servers for not only wireless, for 802.1x wired, which is very similar to wireless, obviously. But then also the ability to say that, we're going to utilize that Radius server for VPN, for remote devices, for guest access devices. There's so many different ways to repurpose that structure of Radius. And that's what customers are looking for, is the way to say, well, I use this particular solution to solve one problem. How can I use that same solution to solve multiple problems within an environment so I don't have to buy separate infrastructures for all of these? Now, the Radius server, believe it or not, most of the Radius servers that are out there already do support the ability to do 99% of what NAC offers. So the Radius servers is sort of the answer. And everybody is trying to utilize that to be able to do what they need to do. The problem is the hardware. The hardware at the far end, the access points, the VPNs, those guys, because each one of the different vendors say, well, I have this particular rule or I have this particular NAC feature that this guy doesn't have, they're differentiating themselves, but unfortunately what they're doing is differentiating themselves only in an environment where that particular, where that particular vendor is the prevalent, device. And honestly, it's become a real issue for folks, and I suspect there's going to be a lot of changes in that particular environment to where they come back and say, well, we need to standardize. There is a group of standards that are being developed right now in the 802.1x realm, and NAC is, like I said, NAC's been on the board for 10 years, and there were a lot of startups that happened, and a lot of folks went down that road in the early 2000 time frame and really started to build that, but it lost so much momentum when they splintered and decided to take those solutions to be proprietary to the different devices. So, interesting. Thank you for that, Nat.
Any other questions?
At this time, I'm showing no further questions over the phone lines.
All right.
Okay, Paul, if you want to roll to the next slide, then we'll let you do a summary and then pass it back to me.
Perfect. So in summary, what I'd like to just, kind of talk to everyone specifically about is 802.1x wireless has been around for a very long time. Radius has been around for a very long time. There are going to be changes in these particular environments. What we're trying to do from a security standpoint at CA is to get in front of some of those. So these are the kinds of conversations that I urge you each to have with your customers. It's interesting that we try to all be that sort of, a trusted advisor. And when we're not trying to sell them things all the time, they'll open up with us some information. And maybe we're not trying to sell them something today, but maybe we're looking at something in the future. And again, from a security standpoint within CA, having these kinds of conversations with customers, opening doors, creating that relationship is key to how we're going to be able to solve their problems not only this year, but next year and beyond. So again, hopefully you got some good information about this, and I'll pass it back to you, Clayton. Thank you very much, everyone.
Thanks, Paul. Appreciate it, and a lot of good information, really helpful, and it helps us know better how we can talk to our customers and use this and really help them get what they need out of their security environment. Next week, we'll be talking about gamification, and so look forward to that, and we appreciate everybody joining us today. Hopefully you'll join us next week and get your friends out here too. It's going to be a fun session about gamification. It's a hot topic, and we're going to talk about it in terms of how we can do some fun things with it, not just in education. So until then, we look forward to visiting with you. If you have any questions, give us a shout, and until then, good selling.
Thanks, everyone.